Section 1, Subsection 1, Unit 1. Climate Finance, Importance, Structure, Trends and Finance Flows. Welcome to the course Access to Urban Climate Finance. By the end of this unit, you will be able to define climate finance and other relevant terminologies, recognize the significance of the role of local and regional governments in accomplishing global objectives, understand the climate funding gap, local demand and supply, identify the main trends and finance flows at subnational level, understand climate financing and green recovery trends after the COVID-19 pandemic, and identify local barriers to obtaining investment levels and potential ways to overcome them. Prior to defining climate finance, let's introduce some context. The ability of nations to prevent climate change and reduce emissions varies a lot. Yet, climate action requires extensive investments, especially in developing countries. In accordance with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, industrialized nations must offer financial resources to help developing countries in adopting climate change mitigation and adaptation measures. The UN Conference of the Parties and the Paris Agreement reiterate the need for funding and cooperative efforts to build a financial system that mobilizes climate money from multiple sources, tools, and channels. How can we define climate finance? One answer could point to a type of financing that seeks to support climate change mitigation and adaptation actions. Urban climate finance includes all sources of finance flowing to and within cities and channeled by all types of public and private actors towards climate mitigation and adaptation. Why are we looking at the subnational level? Cities are at the front line of the climate challenge. Around 70% of them are already experiencing its impacts. Almost half the world's population lives in cities, and 1.5 million people move there each week. This not only causes further strain on their infrastructure, services, and employment markets. It also exacerbates their negative contribution to climate change and environmental degradation. In addition, cities are already responsible for 70% of the global CO2 emissions, which is expected to rise in the future. Local climate action is the need of the hour. However, local and regional governments alone cannot finance and implement the massive climate infrastructure projects. All levels of government need to step up their efforts and enhance the capacity of cities to plan for and implement climate-related measures. In fact, local efforts could considerably contribute to the execution of the nationally determined contributions and national adaptation plans. They also help advance global objectives such as the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals. Yet, despite all their great transformative potential, local governments continue to face one big obstacle: financing. What are the current constraining factors and barriers to climate finance? To better comprehend the flow of capital, let's first look at the demand and supply of climate investments. In this context, the demand can be understood as the investment needed in infrastructure to address climate change mitigation and adaptation in cities. The current projections suggest that such investment on urban infrastructure could amount between $4.5 and $5.4 trillion per year until 2050. In particular, climate investments in developing economies remain insufficient, and climate change adaptation continues to represent a small fraction of the total. In fact, just 9% of global climate money flows went to adaptation between 2017 and 2018. As for the supply, reports estimate that in 2017 and 18, urban climate finance flows to cities reached around $384 billion. In the same year, Western Europe and North America accounted for most of the all-urban climate finance investments. Mitigation still accounts for 90% of climate finance. Climate financing flows show that infrastructure investment demand needs of urban areas are higher than the actual investment. Unfortunately, since 2015, the finance gap has been growing. The last report on the landscape of urban climate finance for 2017 and 18 showed that urban climate financing flows averaged at $384 billion. That's well behind what is required. There is an extensive gap in adaptation and resilience finance, which currently stands at less than 10% of the overall climate finance directed to cities. Looking at the trends, private finance plays a big role in urban climate finance. Household expenditures account for 35% of the total. Public sector investment averaged $84 billion annually, comprising 22% of the total urban climate finance. The largest contributors were national and local governments with an investment of around $60 billion. Let's look at how the COVID-19 pandemic impacted climate finance. The COVID-19 pandemic worsened the finance deficit even more. In fact, local governments' financial resources were redirected towards protecting public health, hence affecting their ability to provide other services such as sanitation and mobility. At the same time, the tendency for local governments to rely more on national transfers has increased. Yet, this crisis also offers an exceptional chance to rethink some investments and design them with green and inclusive principles that enhance resilience in cities. There are certain positive variables that affect climate financing patterns and flows. For instance, through green recovery stimulus packages, development banks are increasing their climate obligations. Local governments may use these stimuli to steer their economic recovery toward resilience and climate responsiveness. COVID-19 didn't just create new challenges. It often exacerbated issues that existed before. In fact, local governments constantly face challenges to mobilizing and accessing financing. Often, they lack the technical and financial competences to develop and execute infrastructure projects, particularly to meet private and public investment criteria. All these competences, for instance, are important to develop those megaprojects with a solid financial model that fit the investment size sought by private investors. The limited fiscal autonomy and control over their own resources also limits local governments' ability to borrow and make certain decisions. Another constant challenge is the lack of knowledge and ability to use different financial sources and instruments. For example, the innovative financial mechanisms that will be explained in the following units of this training course. Last, the absence of a regulatory framework can also hinder or slow down the mobilization of financial resources for subnational governments. When a new administration takes office, investment climate initiatives may be deprioritized, especially if not aligned with long-term objectives and plans. What can be done to overcome such constraining factors and barriers to better access to finance? Addressing the climate finance gap requires actions at the national, regional, or local level, depending on the specific context. However, there are some general recommendations that governments can explore. Multilevel governance and vertical integration can improve political stability and decision-making by ensuring political buy-in and government alignment. A local climate initiative aligned with long-term plans is more likely to remain a priority, regardless of municipal administrative changes. This stability is particularly important for an investor's creditworthiness. Local governments' officials require capacity building to mobilize climate finance. Engaging external experts through initiatives and programs empowers these officials and makes them less reliant from external assistance and knowledge. To provide an enabling regulatory environment, national and subnational policies, plans, and fiscal systems must encourage resource flow, stability, transparency, and credibility to attract investment. For instance, a reform in the legislative framework that gives local governments more authority in using and regulating their own source earnings can help the city attract additional investment funds. Furthermore, budgets should include green investments. Climate change measures should be included in project ideation and design. Securing seed funding will help the project to not rely on external support and ensure its implementation. Grouping projects that are related to each other will lower individual risks and scale up the investment necessary to attract major investors. This grouping can be done based on geographic considerations, industry, or focus. Collaborating with city networks and creating partnerships can provide technical advice and connections with financiers. Finally, one funding source rarely serves its purpose. Hence, both public and private support from various sources is advised. Increasing investments in urban adaptation entails promoting nature-based solutions, including green infrastructure elements into grey infrastructure projects, exploring innovative ways of own public sources, such as taxation and land value capture, aggregating projects, combining mitigation co-benefits, leveraging the municipal bond market, and exploring insurance funds. The Chinese National Program on Sponge Cities provides a case study on how to create an enabling environment for climate funding and action. The initiative planned and implemented local green and blue infrastructure to alleviate China's water shortages and flood risks. To make this program possible, the national government offered financial assistance in the form of grants to local governments for 3 years, along with capacity building. The funding source was private, obtained through public-private partnerships for the urban green infrastructure included in the program. To this end, procurement management strategies were created to promote commercial investments, partnering with local governments. Before closing this first unit, we invite you to watch the video found within the additional materials of this unit. Here, the mayor of Makati City, Abigail Binay, talks about her experience accessing climate finance. Choose 2 of the recommendations she mentions for an enabling environment, and tell us in the discussion space how these elements look like in your municipality or region, and how they have been implemented. Here are the key points to keep in mind from this unit. The climate crisis requires subnational climate funding. Investment in adaptation-focused initiatives is much behind demand, as well as all investments in climate finance, creating a financial gap. Adverse international events can have both a negative and positive effect in relation to climate finance. For instance, what has been observed during the COVID-19 pandemic? The climate finance landscape is diverse and subnational governments need to scale up investments from different sources. Intergovernmental actions have a crucial role in creating an enabling environment, recruiting investors, and closing the investment gap.